We're going to begin looking at Elizabeth by having a look at the England that she ruled over and also what society was like in the country at the time. So if we begin with population, at the start of Elizabeth's reign, there were about 2.8 million people living in England. By the end of it, there were 4.1 million people, so the population was growing really quickly. Of those people, the vast majority lived and worked in the countryside. So 90% of Elizabethans made a living on the land, which only left 10% to live in the towns and the cities. There is a really slow process of urbanisation going on at this time, and people are gradually moving from the countryside to the towns, but it's too slow to make a difference to the overall picture at this time. You can see it when you have a look at the population figures for the towns and the countries. So London, for example, the capital city, was estimated to have 100,000 people in the 1550s. It's quite difficult to tell. But by 1600, it's thought to have had 200,000 people. So the towns and the cities are getting bigger. Whether you lived in the towns or the cities, though, life in Elizabethan England was quite difficult and quite dangerous. So the average life expectancy of an Elizabethan was about 42 years old. To put that into context, the average life expectancy in Britain in 2017 was 81. So that's really quite low. Obviously, because it's an average life expectancy, it's not that people were all dropping dead on their 42nd birthday. It's that a lot of people weren't making it to a very great age at all. So it's estimated that 14% of all babies died before their first birthday. And then on top of that, there was a 20 to 30% chance that people would die before their 16th birthday. So a lot of Elizabethans didn't make it into adulthood. Now, there wasn't a police force in Elizabethan times, and there wasn't a standing army, so there was no real way of controlling large groups of people. Instead, society relied on people understanding the idea of what they called the great chain of being. And this is kind of the idea that there's a place for everyone and everyone has their place, and society relied on everybody knowing their place and understanding their place and accepting their place and doing their best within it. At the top of the great chain of being was God, the most important and powerful being in the universe, and his representative in England was seen as being the person that he had chosen as monarch. Monarch is a word that you're probably going to come across a lot in this course, so I'll write it here. It's a nice unisex term that can refer to a king or a queen. So there it is. Obviously the monarch in Elizabethan times was Elizabeth, and she was seen as being the queen by the grace of God. Later on, this idea develops into something called the divine right, and it's the idea that God is all powerful and God is all knowing, so he doesn't make mistakes. So if Elizabeth was the queen, then that was because God had chosen her and that was the right thing for her to be. Obviously, she was the most powerful and wealthy and important person in the country. However, beneath Elizabeth, there was another class of powerful and wealthy and important people, and they were known as the nobility. So here we are. And the nobility was a very small group that was made up of noble families. So there were about 50 or so noble families in Elizabethan England. And at the head of each was somebody who had a lot of land and a really important title, like a duke or an earl or a baron. They were incredibly wealthy. They had a very luxurious lifestyle. They often had households of more than 100 servants. And really there were two ways to become a member of the nobility. The first one, and the most common one, was through inheritance. It was passed down through families, so it's what we call hereditary. You had to be born into it. When your father died, he would pass his land and his title on to you. The other way that people could become members of the nobility was if Elizabeth awarded them with the title and the land, but Elizabeth tended not to do this. The Tudors were quite worried about the nobility. They were a threat to them, so they tried to keep them as a small and manageable group. Underneath the nobility is a group that I find rather more interesting. In Elizabethan times, this is known as the gentry. It makes up about 5% of the population. Quite often, these were the descendants of knights. Sometimes they were called squires. Sometimes they were called gentlemen. And they might inherit some of their wealth. They were wealthy enough not to work, but they also might have earned their wealth through business or trade or good land management and things like that. So they are a really influential group in Elizabethan society. They're very energetic and proactive, and they make things happen. So the Queen's advisor Walsingham, for example, was one of the gentry. Also Shakespeare, people like Sir Francis Drake, and so on. They really sort of push Elizabethan history forward. Beneath those, we have a group of what's known as the yeomanry. It's spelt yeomanry, but it's pronounced yeomanry. Elizabethans sometimes referred to these as the middling classes. And they're really usually farmers who are quite comfortably off. So they have enough money for a comfortable lifestyle, but not enough that they don't have to work. And also not enough to be completely safe. So illness or bad luck might mean that, threaten their position. And it might mean that their lives get worse. There's two different categories. Yeomen owned their land. Whereas other members of the yeomanry might rent their land from somebody else, and then they were known as tenant farmers. Beneath the yeomanry, there's a class of people who don't have land. These are known as the labouring poor. And they would really be reliant on whatever employment they could get. Life was quite precarious for them. It was a bit of a struggle to survive. In the countryside, they would probably work on other people's land. Beneath those, there is a group of people who don't have land or money or a job, unemployed, quite often homeless. Those are called vagabonds. Now, generally, this is the system in the countryside, which, remember, was the greater majority of people. Things were quite different, really, in the towns. Elizabethan sources from the time say that people in the towns automatically assumed that they were more important than other people. But because they're not tied to the land, their position tends to be more attached to their profession and what they do for work. So at the top of the pile in the towns, there were merchants. England had a really thriving wool and cloth trade, and merchants could become very rich by selling to other countries. Beneath those was a class of professionals. So these are people like doctors and lawyers. And then there was also a class of business owners and skilled workers. So most skilled trades like smiths and shoemakers, for example, in Elizabethan times belonged to something called the guild system. And this was a system where you entered with no skills as an apprentice. When you'd learnt enough, you became something called a journeyman, and then you could offer your skills and go and work for other people. When you were as skilled as you could be, you became a master and you had the right to open your own business. So there's business owners and there's skilled workers as well. There's then a group of workers who don't have any skills in the towns, and they're known as, surprisingly enough, unskilled workers. And again, they're rather like the labouring poor. They rely on whatever employment they can get. And then there were vagabonds in the towns as well. So this is the social hierarchy. You'll notice it's all men. I'm sorry about that, it's not very representative. There were women, of course, in Elizabethan England, but they, as social status, tended to be defined by what the man did. That's the reason for that. Now, there is a degree of mobility. People can move up and down within this system. So some of the things that might move people up included marriage. If you married into a higher class, you could belong to that class. Also, by growing wealth. So, for example, the yeomanry might be able to become gentry if they did well enough, and also from the monarch. So if the Queen decided to award you with any wealth or lands or help, that could move you up a class as well. Moving down was also possible, and that could be caused by things like illness and bad luck. Could be caused by crime. Members of the nobility could lose their title if they were found guilty of treason, and also if you upset your family and they kicked you out. That was called being disowned. It was possible as well for example, merchants to become members of the gentry, and for professionals to become members of the gentry as well. So if we zoom out, this is the social structure under Elizabeth.